Good afternoon. Thank you for being here for our August Lunch and Learn program with the Eisenhower Presidential Library. I am so pleased that you have decided to spend some time with us today. I'm really looking forward to this program. This program is a part of our anniversary celebration of the 19th Amendment that the entire National Archives and Records Administration is participating in. So I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. But first, I need to say a very special thank you to our speaker for agreeing to join us today. She was scheduled for earlier in the year, but because of the pandemic, we had to move our calendars around. So I'm very thankful for her patience as we figure out how to do this online and her flexibility for moving her program to August. So I would like to welcome our speaker so that we can learn more about the Chautauqua movement. And I am going to let her tell you a little bit about herself so you get to look at her instead of me. So Sarah Bell, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Dawn, for having me. I know I was talking to Dawn and Samantha a couple days ago and saying that, of course, I would have preferred and loved to have been there in person and really looking forward to the day when I'm able to visit the Eisenhower and see the newly renovated museum. But until then, very thankful for technology that allows us to still gather together today. And I just want to make sure I have lost the presentation. So Samantha, I don't know if you're able to share there it is. Great, thank you. So my presentation today is actually based on some research that I did for my dissertation. So last May, which seems very, very long ago, in May 2019, I received my PhD in history from KU. And I still live in Lawrence and work in Lawrence. I actually work at the Watkins Museum of History, and I am the development officer there. But I also joined the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau in 2018. And the presentation that I give is this one, although in recognition of the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, I made sure to focus in more specifically on women's suffrage, because obviously that is a very relevant topic this year. And so the presentation I'll be giving today is a summary of some of the research I did for my dissertation, which looked at the Chautauqua movement. So you'll get to hear a lot more about the Chautauqua today with its connection to women's suffrage and other political activities as well. And so for my research, I actually looked at Chautauqua assemblies in New York, in Kansas, and in Colorado, and was able to visit archives in all of those states and in DC at the Library of Congress, which was a really cool experience. And my research question was prompted by a source that I found really early on. And it was that Susan B. Anthony and Anna Howard Shaw showed up in Ottawa and spoke at the Chautauqua in that town, Ottawa Chautauqua, in 1892 and returned a couple years later in 1894. And I was so intrigued by this because the little that I did know about the Chautauqua, the fact that it was this really religious, respectable type of movement and assembly, and knowing that how radical women's suffrage really was at this time, particularly still in the 19th century, I wondered, how did two prominent suffrage leaders end up speaking at a small town at Chautauqua in Kansas in the 1890s? So my presentation today will be the answer to that question. I'll be taking you from 1874, when the Chautauqua began in Western New York State, to the first decade of the 20th century, when suffrage became a regular topic on the Chautauqua program. And I have examples from New York, Colorado, and Kansas, but most of my presentation focuses in on examples from Kansas. And this is for a few reasons. First, I just really enjoy sharing the history of the state with people who live here. And some of you may have heard this already, I am not a native Kansan. I have lived in Kansas for 10 years and have really grown to love and appreciate this state. And that is because, for my second reason, Kansas has this really unique and interesting history of social reforms. And what I found is that women were often right in the heart of them. And so I'll be walking you through the timelines of two major movements, the Chautauqua and women's suffrage. But I'll be including some other women's reforms as well. And I'll be showing you why I decided to bring these two timelines, these two movements together in conversation and the significance of why these two movements interacted. I have a lot of really great photos that'll be illustrating my points, and most of them are from the Franklin County Historical Society in Ottawa, while others are from the Kansas Historical Society. So with that, let's begin. And you can see, what is Chautauqua? Well, as I mentioned, it began in 1874 in Western New York State. And I have it highlighted there on this map in red. And that star is a very rough approximation of where Chautauqua started and actually still continues today. Two Methodists decided to start the Chautauqua, pictured there, John Vincent and Lewis Miller. They modeled the Chautauqua after the revivalist camp meetings that had been so popular within the Methodist Church just a couple decades before. If you think about the Second Great Awakening, kind of in that 1840s, 1850s period, especially in this, what was called the burned over district, which would include New York, this is what they were sort of had in mind. But they didn't want their Chautauqua to be quite as evangelistic or sensational as what those camp meetings had turned into. But they wanted to hold on to a couple aspects of it, namely this emphasis on being in nature and worshiping outdoors. And I'm often asked how Chautauqua got its name. And a lot of times I'm asked if the Chautauqua actually has something to do with Native Americans. And the name itself does. Chautauqua was a tribe of Native Americans that lived in that region of New York. And so the county where Chautauqua started, and there's a lake, both have that name, pulled the name from that Native American tribe. So Chautauqua, from its name, has that Native American origin, but really nothing else after that, other than that, had any connections to Native Americans. Now, when Vincent and Miller started their Chautauqua, they originally intended this to be a place to train Sunday school teachers, who at that time in the 1870s were primarily women. But they coupled this education with a leisure experience that included a retreat to a beautiful natural space. And it was so successful in its first year that the Chautauqua became this annual summer event where visitors would come and camp out in tents for 7 to 10 days at first before it started to grow with the number of weeks. They would listen to lectures, have discussions with their fellow attendees, attend musical performances, and so forth. And as you can see from this image, from 1881, less than 10 years after the Chautauqua started, the Chautauqua quickly expanded. And it's a little hard to tell, but on the bottom of that picture, it says Chautauqua Lake. So the Chautauqua really made good use of its real estate along that lake. And, but also the way that it built itself out, from this map, it really looks similar to a city or a town with how it's structured. So in addition to spreading and growing in New York, the Chautauqua actually spread across the country as well. And it was so successful, but of course not everyone can make the long journey all the way to New York. So these other assemblies started to pop up across the country. Now, these were known as independent or daughter assemblies after the mother Chautauqua in New York. And they were modeled directly after the New York program. From the same kind of lectures and type of lecturers that they had come to holding their assembly in a park or alongside a body of water to emulate that natural, beautiful experience. The Chautauqua really maintained its emphasis on religious education, which is how it started. But with its rising popularity and success, it added other more secular topics to its program: science, current events, arts, literature. They even had activities for children. And many of these independent assemblies were looking to the New York and were modeling themselves directly after, and often would even invite the same speakers who were showing up in New York to come to their assembly as well. And by 1902, as this picture shows, the Chautauqua movement had become so popular that a journal, now granted, I should say a journal published by the Chautauqua, so possibly a bit of boosterism here, but they were estimating that there were more than 100 different Chautauqua assemblies across the country. And one of these, which I have starred, was in Ottawa, Kansas. Now, Kansas actually had the first Chautauqua assembly west of the Mississippi River in Bismarck Grove, which was outside of Lawrence, and that was in 1878. Now, surprisingly, it didn't last there for more than a few years. And I say surprisingly because Bismarck Grove, if you're familiar with this, had its claim to fame, or the reason it was known for being a gathering space, was because of its emphasis with prohibition, or temperance, prohibiting alcohol. And with Chautauqua, one of the founders, John Vincent, was actually very much an avid prohibitionist. He was very much against alcohol. So here we have Bismarck Grove, which was this outdoor space. It was known for its connection to temperance, to prohibition. And it was just really interesting that it didn't last there very long. And some of the reasons why, there was an indication that perhaps the people of Lawrence weren't all that supportive of the Chautauqua and Bismarck Grove. And so it just really wasn't able to have a successful assembly there. So from there, the Chautauqua bounced over to Topeka for 1 year in 1882, but it didn't make it there for very long because in Topeka, despite the fact that Kansas in 1881 had actually passed an amendment to prohibit alcohol, in 1882, apparently Topekans were still drinking alcohol because there was some notes that the Chautauqua couldn't stay in Topeka because of its continued connection to alcohol. And so after that, it landed in Ottawa for 1 year in 1883. And that is where it lasted and had for over 30 years, as you can see, through 1914. And there were several other Chautauqua assemblies in Kansas, including in Winfield, Lincoln Park, and Wathena, but Ottawa had the longest and most successful assembly in the state. So in 1896, the population of Ottawa was 6,000 people. And the Chautauqua, not just in Ottawa, but really all the Chautauqua assemblies, tried to always situate themselves within more rural or small town communities. And this is what the Ottawa Chautauqua said about themselves that year in 1896. They said that the Ottawa Chautauqua is sufficiently far from large cities to be free from their vagabond, disreputable classes, and possesses all the charms of rural quietness with nearly every convenience of metropolitan life. They also called their Chautauqua the ideal city, or a tented city of delight, with this sweet and gracious social life, a city which is cheerfully occupied with pleasant and lovely things, and at all times clothed in its mind of culture and peace. So it's really interesting to see that language, because the Ottawa Chautauqua, like so many of the other assemblies, really was trying to be this perfect blend of this more rural, pastoral type of living, but also having still those conveniences of living in the city. And you can see this with the photos here. The one on the left is actually a picture of the entrance to Forest Park, where in Ottawa, the Chautauqua was held. And the picture on the right is called Terrace Row. And this showing these line of tents lined up so neatly. And throughout the entire time that the Ottawa Chautauqua was around, people would come and camp in tents in Kansas in the summer. So just picture that for a second as we're sitting in some 90-degree heat. And but even despite that, they kept it lined up really neatly, which kind of emulates and think about that map of Chautauqua in New York, where everything looks to be on these very nice straight lines, kind of emulating that city or town style. So in addition to hosting an annual summer gathering, the Ottawa Chautauqua, similar to the Chautauqua in New York, published a monthly newspaper, which they called the Ottawa Chautauqua Assembly Herald. And this advertised primarily their summer program. And this photo, which I know is a little hard to read, but I really just wanted to show it more as an example. And what it shows is 1 day of programming, which I pulled out an inset from one of the pages of its paper in 1894. So what you see in May of 1894, the inset that I pulled out is Temperance Day. On Temperance Day, a visitor could engage in some kind of an activity at the Ottawa Chautauqua from 6:30 a.m. to 8 o'clock p.m. They could participate in all sorts of things, including prayers, chorus training, listen to a variety of lectures on all sorts of different topics, attend a teacher's conference, participate in a roundtable discussion, and enjoy an instrumental music concert. What's interesting to see is that the Ottawa Chautauqua, of course, came to an end in 1914, but the New York Chautauqua still continues today. And the schedule really remains as full as it was 120 years before. And I actually got the chance to visit the New York Chautauqua 3 years ago. And I like to include this as kind of to show the parallels. Now, this is the abbreviated calendar This is not, when I actually arrived at the Chautauqua in 2017, I received a huge sheet of paper that showed all of the activities that I could participate in for that entire week that I was going to be there. And it's the same kind of thing. I could have done something from sunrise to well after sunset. And it has that same kind of structure where there were lectures, there were musical concerts, there were other discussions that I could do in small groups. I could take tours. I could do all, if I wanted to, I could jam pack my day. But of course, I could also just sit and relax and enjoy the beautiful space out there as well. But what is fascinating is also to see that this emphasis on education, music, and religion are still on the agenda today, showing that that has been a continuity from the Chautauqua from its very beginning. Now, the Chautauqua was really geared and designed for a really specific group of people. And I've already shown a couple of pictures from the Ottawa Chautauqua, and you'll see on this next slide that this is more of a close-up on some of the participants who actually attended the Chautauqua. And this group of people was really the Protestant white middle class. This was who the Chautauqua was really designed for and who attended the Chautauqua. And we know it's really for the middle class because we can look at to see how much it costs to actually attend a Chautauqua. And so in $1890, what you could attend just for a day, you could pay 25 cents, and $1.50 for a 10-day pass for the entire season, which in our dollars today, that's about $7 for a day pass and $42 for a season ticket. So pretty reasonable. People could also rent a tent, like I have pictured here, for $5 for the season, which is about $140 in today's terms. And so some people did come just for a day. Maybe there was a certain lecture or performance that they wanted to hear, and others stayed for the entire week. Chautauqua assemblies were in rural and small town venues, like I mentioned, really not in urban centers or cities, and that was intentional. The Chautauqua attracted farmers, teachers, club women, and other middle-class professionals who wanted to participate in leisure while still improving their mind. Think back to that schedule. There is a reason why they were trying to pack that in, because you didn't want to be too leisurely. You still wanted to have this idea of self-improvement and education. And railroads were really key for getting people to the Chautauqua. And it's actually one of the reasons why it was so successful in Ottawa, because Ottawa, during that time period of the late 19th, early 20th century, was really a hub for a lot of railroads in Kansas. Now, I really like these photos because it shows a close-up of a couple of the tents. You think back to that terraced road that I already showed you. And what it shows is entire families would come to the Chautauqua and participated. And that was something that I think was especially unique at Chautauqua and why it was so appealing, primarily even for women, because women were able to take a break from their household chores and from taking care of their children, because the Chautauqua actually provided activities for children as well as for adults. But I like this picture on the left because it shows, obviously a very big family, and I just always wonder, do they all stay in that one small tent? It just seems like that would have been really cramped. But the picture on the left is another example of a tent and a woman at the Chautauqua. And actually this is an interesting picture because she is cooking at a stove that assumingly she may have brought with her. But the other aspect of the Chautauqua is that women actually didn't have to do that. There was a dining hall at the Chautauqua. So again, women were able to take a break from doing the cooking and doing these other chores. But of course, if you wanted to, you could bring it along. Now, one of the things about the Chautauqua, and you'll see this with the next slide with a few photos that I have, is that while the educational program was this important component, the creators really emphasized that assembly needed to be in an idyllic, natural space. Maybe in a park alongside a lake was really a high priority. And so I have a few examples here of some of the Chautauquas that I studied and looked at in my dissertation. And what you can see are tall trees, which provide shade, there's water, and there's mountains. And I like to, we'll take a minute to actually focus in on those photos. So the bottom left is a photo from the Ottawa Chautauqua. So this is in Forest Park, and it's alongside, in Forest Park, if you're familiar with Ottawa at all, there's a river that runs through it. So thus the tall trees and the shade, because again, being in Kansas outdoors in the summer, we all know how hot it can get. The picture on the right is actually a picture that I took in New York, Chautauqua in 2017. It is a picture that shows that lake. And really, if you look just to the right of that photo is where the Chautauqua Assembly kind of grows from there. But the picture on the top left, now this is the one example that I have from Colorado, but I love to include it because if you look really closely, you can see women hiking in those rocks. And those are actually, this is the prominent mountain structure in Boulder, which is the Flatirons. And they're women who are with their walking sticks and their very long skirts who are hiking up the Flatirons. And I got to visit Boulder a few years ago to do some research. And of course I had to hike the Flatirons. And I just kept this photo in my mind of these women who are hiking up the Flatirons in their dresses as I was huffing and puffing in my tennis shoes and my shorts, and just really had even more respect for them. But what's really fascinating is between Boulder and Ottawa. So Ottawa started about 15 years before the Boulder Chautauqua did. And the Ottawa Chautauqua really called itself it was the best Chautauqua in the West, because Kansas really defined itself as being in the West, as a Western state during this time. But when Boulder showed up 15 years later, it was saying that it was the greatest assembly in the West. And I kind of joke about was like, I think Boulder ended up winning because the Boulder Chautauqua actually is still going on today. And also it's really hard to beat mountains when you're talking about the West. And Ottawa had other issues about why it had to close down, but I just kind of have to chuckle about that. I was like, well, I think Boulder won that competition. So I mentioned that the New York Chautauqua has run continuously since it started. And then there was this second wave, the independent assemblies, like the ones at Ottawa, the ones at Boulder. But there was a third iteration of the Chautauqua that really came to prominence from about 1905 to the 1920s. And this was called the Circuit Chautauqua. And a lot of times when people, if they actually know about Chautauqua, it is often they're familiar with this third iteration of the Chautauqua. This is where, unlike having to visit a Chautauqua, like in New York or Ottawa or so forth, the Chautauqua would come to you, actually really similar to a circus during this time. And in fact, the circuit Chautauqua and the circuses were going on, and sometimes they occurred in the same towns. And so the circuit Chautauquas still had similar programming, but they took a turn to more entertainment-based topics. So they included theater on their performances, minstrel shows, and other kinds of what became a little more sensational and entertainment focused. And circuits really came to an end by the end of the 1920s as they could not compete with other forms of entertainment that was starting to emerge at that time: radio, movies, and the automobile, which gave people more freedom. Okay, so this ends my overview about the Chautauqua, and I'm going to shift in more to talking more about women at the Chautauqua specifically. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, women really were the primary audience from the beginning, the Sunday school teachers that Vincent wanted to educate. But John Vincent, one of these founders, who was a Methodist minister, really, while he allowed women to be in the audience to listen to things, he did not want them to actually be lecturing to an audience. And this is really because of something that was known as the separate spheres ideology at this time. You could also kind of label it as gender roles. This idea, especially for the white middle class, that emphasized that women really needed to stay and maintain the home. That was their domain, while men were the ones that were taking care of the public, professional activities. And so that also included things like speaking in public. And someone like John Vincent, who grew up and was raised in and taught by the Methodist Church, definitely bought into that belief, because this was something that was also the church and the society at that time was kind of dictating and explaining to women, especially like that middle class, that this was really your proper role in society. And so while he was progressive enough to want to educate women, he had limits on what their participation looked like. However, Vincent's ban of women speakers really did not last long. And in 1876, Frances Willard became the first woman to speak at the Chautauqua. And so just 2 years later, and she was really known for her leadership with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is also known as the WCTU. Now, the WCTU was one of the largest and most influential women's reform groups in the United States during the late 19th century. The WCTU actually got their start out of a group that first year in 1874 at Chautauqua. A lot of women came together, so these Sunday school teachers, and they were talking to each other about the importance of trying to figure out if they could get all of their small temperance organizations within their towns or maybe their states, if they could somehow get it to be a national organization, a national movement. And so that fall, they actually did that very thing, and the WCTU had its start. Now, WCTU emphasized home protection. They were justifying that their participation in politics and in public was really because they were trying to protect the domestic sphere, the home. And because of this connection, and this is something to think about during this time, is really where this was coming from, where their argument was coming from. Temperance and concerns about alcohol had been around for decades prior to the 1870s, and it had been something that both men and women were concerned about. But by the 1870s, so this is post-Civil War, we have a lot of men who had just gone through this horrific war, and alcohol was starting to be, it was not just that they were drinking beer, a weaker beer, a lower alcohol content, but hard liquor was becoming more and more popular. And what was happening was that these men were spending more time in saloons, they were drinking more alcohol, they were drinking harder liquor, and they were possibly drinking away some salaries and income. They were coming home and beating their wives and their children. And women who had so little protection and were so reliant on the men in their lives because they really weren't allowed to engage and work within the public sphere, knew they had to do something. And so they had this kind of moral authority when it came to this issue of temperance. And so in 1874 with the WCTU, temperance really firmly became associated with women and protecting the home. So someone like John Vincent, who was reluctant to have women speakers, still recognized this moral authority that women had, and thus Frances Willard used her connection to temperance as the means of entry onto the Chautauqua platform. So Frances Willard was the first woman to speak at Chautauqua, but she was not the last, and other women lectured on temperance as well. They talked about literature, art, music, all sorts of very feminine, womanly topics, but no suffrage. So it's interesting because women who attended the New York Chautauqua, and there were many of them, were becoming pretty frustrated with John Vincent. Here's this man who supported education for women. He allowed the WCTU and other women speakers. Why could he not give space for talking about women's suffrage? So one of the sources that I really used to understand this transition within the Chautauqua and how it got from no women speakers to all the way to women's suffrage, there was a source that I looked at called the Woman's Journal. This was a suffrage journal out of Boston and I looked at it between 1876 to 1917, so for 40 years. And I looked to see how do they talk about the Chautauqua. And what I saw during this time is I saw this frustration coming in with letters to the editor, with articles written by some of the editors of the journal talking about the Chautauqua, talking about Vincent and his reluctance to really support suffrage. But to fully understand Vincent's reluctance, it is important to remember that women's suffrage, as I mentioned in the beginning, was considered a very radical topic at this time, especially still in the late 19th century. Because according to the separate spheres ideology for men and women, politics was in the realm of men. Politics was a dirty business. Women, these moral creatures, should not be involved with it. Something like the WCTU was more acceptable because women were only arguing. They were entering the public sphere in order to better protect the domestic one. But suffrage, well, suffrage just pushed women or pulled women right outside of the home and into the public. And there's this great political cartoon that I think does a good job of exemplifying this. And this idea, this fear that this would be a complete reversal of the ideas of proper societal roles for men and women. So what would happen if women were no longer in the home? Well, of course, this is what is exemplified on this political cartoon. In 1909, still several years after the time period I'm talking about, is that if women were off voting or participating in politics or in the public, then who would be left at home to take care of the dishes and the crying babies? Those poor men, those poor husbands, and those poor fathers. So you can see this was what the suffragists were really fighting against, this idea of what it was that was proper for women at this time. And I will note that this wasn't just men who were against suffrage. There were plenty of women who were also worried about this very thing, that what would happen if it upset this really balanced separate spheres. Now, I want to pause just for a second and show you a timeline of women's suffrage in Kansas, because I want to show how, when we're talking about Chautauqua and all these dates that I'm talking about, that there was another really important timeline going on around women's suffrage, and especially in Kansas. Kansas really had a fascinating connection to women's suffrage and was a leader in many ways. So this started early on, actually even before this, Kansas became a state, with a woman named Clarina Nichols. She attended the 1859 Constitutional Convention, and she tried and failed to get full suffrage for women included in the state constitution. But she did get some other things for women that were pretty significant at that time. One of these, really significantly, was the right for women to vote in school board elections. Kansas was the first state in the country to actually give women that right to vote in the Constitution, in their state constitution. However, she also got a couple of other things: guardianship rights for children, and property laws. This is important because the Married Women's Property Act was starting to become the norm after 1848, when in New York had passed that law, but there were still a lot of societal expectations about married women. Married women during this mid-19th century and before would actually lose their identity. They'd become essentially property of their husbands. So they would not have those guardianship rights over their children. They would not have property rights. And so the fact that Kansas worked this into their constitution really indicates that they were becoming a leader in the discussion about the legal status and the rights of married women. So a few years later after that, in 1867, Kansas actually had the first attempt in the country to try to actually get women's suffrage added as an amendment to its constitution. It was not successful, unfortunately, but the story sure would have been a lot different if it had been. However, Kansas drew the attention of national leaders, which was already on the radar because of what Clarina Nichols had done a few years before. And so Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, all these women who from their East Coast homes made the long journey to Kansas in 1867 to try to campaign for this vote. 20 years later, Kansas had another first, and this one actually was a success. In 1887, women in Kansas was the first state to give women the right to vote in city elections, municipal suffrage. This was really significant, and it actually ties to something I've already talked about with the Prohibition Amendment from 1881. So this was something that was very much in the camp of Republicans. Democrats were not a fan of prohibition, and Kansas actually had its first Democratic governor in 1882. And so this is the year after the Prohibition Amendment had just been passed by Republicans. And this governor, George Glick, kind of questioned the relevance of the having Prohibition Amendment, and so indicated perhaps he would try to repeal it. So women in Kansas saw their chance, used their connection to Temperance, the WCTU, that moral authority we've been talking about, and they essentially argued to Republican legislators, hey, if you give us the right to vote in city elections, we will help keep prohibition enforced and vote the right men into office. Which, side note, actually ended up resulting in the first woman mayor in the country showing up in Kansas, Susanna Salter in Argonia. But that's another story for another day. Kansas had another attempt at giving full suffrage for women in 1894. That was not successful. But in 1912, Kansas women finally did get the right to vote, full voting rights at local, state, and national levels, which was 8 years before the 19th Amendment. So Kansas was a leader, as you can see, in many social and political reforms for women. But they were not the only state to be agitating for suffrage. And this next slide is such a great image, and I use it a lot in my presentations. And this is from 1914, and it's called The Awakening. And what it shows is this: all of the suffrage activity primarily was successful in the West. And so there was this idea that it was this like Western wave that was moving across the nation. And I love to see Kansas kind of sticking out there like a thumb of sorts, the easternmost state of this Western wave, showing that it was coming to the South and to the East. And so we had states like Colorado in 1893, the first state to give women the right to vote in their constitution, but many other states as well: Utah, Washington, California, and so forth. But to get back to Chautauqua, remember, I mentioned at the beginning, Anna Howard Shaw and Susan B. Anthony show up in Ottawa in 1892, speaking at that Chautauqua, which we know now is tied to that 1894 campaign. So how did the Chautauqua go from first not allowing women speakers at all, to allowing women to speak, but not on suffrage, to finally including suffrage? Well, women pushed for it. So in 1891, Vincent finally acquiesced, and he allowed what he called a Woman's Day at Chautauqua, which I find this terminology so fascinating because, of course, women had been speaking, and there had been other women topics, but this Women's Day indicated that this was going to have suffrage lectures and discussions all afternoon. Now, a fun tie-in to Kansas is that there's this huge auditorium at the New York Chautauqua that can seat 5,000 to 6,000 people. And the newspaper describes that the entire auditorium was covered in yellow bunting, yellow ribbons. And why yellow? Well, the sunflower state of Kansas, of course, which is actually still one of the reasons why yellow or gold has become a color of the movement, was because of Kansas and its leadership, primarily because of what happened in 1887 with the right to vote in city elections. So that's a fun way to show that Kansas, this is not just a historical looking back, but at the time, Kansas was really recognized as that leader. So other Chautauquas saw what New York did with this Women's Day, and they emulated New York, and they wanted to start groups for women as well, including Ottawa. So I mentioned that Ottawa really claimed to be this best of the West with its Chautauqua, and it wanted to rival its Eastern ancestor in New York with this great growing work of supporting women. So Ottawa started a Women's Council in 1892, and they called it a Congress for the growing women's club movement that was starting to really take off during this time. Because in addition to the WCTU forming in the 1870s, of course, for activism for women's suffrage, there was another movement that was starting, which was the Women's Club movement. In 1890, the General Federation of Women's Club began, and Kansas had this huge population of women's clubs. And you're seeing some of these, and you'll see a couple more in some of the photos I've been showing. So the Women's Council published a women's club directory in their monthly newspaper, which included updates for women's clubs, their writing, and their advertisement. This picture, again, very hard to see, but I like to show it as an example, because what the Ottawa Chautauqua did is really interesting. It positioned itself to be this important means of communication for women at a time when not a lot of other newspapers published this kind of information about women, about women's clubs or women's activities and their ideas. And this photo from 1893 shows that the club directory was actually on its front page. Now, of course, in the wintertime, this is the off season for the Chautauqua, so they would be willing to give their newspaper over to the women's clubs. But once it started to get back to the summer, of course, they would take that back in order to publish and talk about the upcoming program. But by 1898, the Assembly Herald had listed over 300 clubs in its directory and circulated 3,000 papers monthly. Now, the Assembly Herald was important for keeping women connected, but the most important thing was that women would come to Ottawa each summer, where will be gathered the largest assembly of club women ever seen in the West. And when club women gathered together, they said the seeds of organization would be then scattered broadcast over the beautiful prairies, which would result in a women's club in every town, village, and school district in the state. Now, these are two of my favorite photos from research that I've seen. I'll start with the one on the left, which you can see is labeled parlor tent. This is a label that was on the photo itself. Now, a parlor is a place where in a home, this is where you would let the public enter the private. So what I find interesting is that here we are in a place where you are in amongst a lot of the public, and yet there was still this emulation of having a space within your privacy of this tent. There was still the private part of the tent, and then there was going to be the part where you let the public come in, or a parlor. So, and you have three women who appear to be maybe doing some needlework or reading, or just talking about the current events. But the next slide is probably maybe my favorite photo, and it is it's a group of women who on the back of their tent, it says hobgoblins. And so this is the Hobgoblin Club. And when I looked it up, a hobgoblin means mischievous imp or sprite. And I am just dying to know more about which group of women decided to call themselves hobgoblins after a mischievous imp. And I actually don't know a ton about this club. The best hint that I got towards is that possibly it was a college. It was a bunch of college women who started this, which I think would probably make the most sense. But I always say in my presentations, if you know anything about the Hobgoblin Club, let me know, because I'm dying to learn more. But back to Shaw and Anthony and suffrage. So in 1892, their visit was an honor for Ottawa never before enjoyed. So in addition to supporting women's clubs, being a directory for them, trying to really publish their papers and hosting them, the Women's Council was actually a place to discuss women's suffrage, which was radical. It was commonly held during this time that women's clubs did not discuss three things: religion, politics, or women's suffrage. So for this women's club focus group at a religious assembly to host suffragists, this was a reflection, I believe, on the progressive nature of Kansas during this time period. Just think back to that timeline I showed and how much activity was going on, especially in the 1880s and 1890s around suffrage. So Laura Johns, who was the president of the state association in Kansas, really urged all the state suffrage workers to come to Ottawa in 1892 for the suffrage conference, because she said this will afford an excellent opportunity for interchange of thought and ought to stimulate our work. And in 1894, Anna Howard Shaw and Susan B. Anthony returned, and they brought with them Carrie Chapman Catt. And she was actually a rising star in the suffrage party, and you may know her name more in connection to helping pass the 19th Amendment in 1920. So she did eventually become the president of the National Association. But in 1893, she was still kind of on her rising up to the leader she'd become. But she had just helped Colorado pass the 1893 amendment. So the Assembly Herald reported that year, 1894, was to the women of Kansas the most important year since the territory became a state. And every club member, women's clubs, was urged to come to Kansas, to Ottawa, as this will be a women's year in Kansas and we should improve it. Now, again, the story would be so much better if we could say, and they were successful, but unfortunately they were not, despite all the efforts of the Chautauqua helping to campaign and advocate for the vote. They were successful in 1912, but by that time, the Ottawa Chautauqua was kind of getting onto its last years. It had been having some financial troubles, and while there was still a women's council, it just didn't have quite the same urgency or advocacy like it did in the 1890s. And so Ottawa held a suffrage debate, but it really wasn't trying to get women to actively go out and campaign. So it does show that while the Chautauqua was trying to help, there were some limitations on how successful it was with suffrage. Now, this next photo, I've talked about some of my favorite photos, but this next photo really is probably the most significant photo I have actually personally found in my research. And I'm going to just pause for a second, just study the photo, and feel free if you want to chat what you see. I will talk about it here in a second, but just take a moment and look at what this photo is showing. So in this photo, we have a few things going on. The title of it is Luncheon at the Ottawa Chautauqua. It's from 1895. And we have, I think it's about 12 women and one man who I always kind of chuckle at. I just feel like, he's kind of like jauntily sitting back. How he got in on this luncheon with all these women is a great question. But of course, I think and hope that what I'm really wanting to focus on is the two women standing in the back. Because at the table, we have women, but of course, all those women are white. And the two women in the back appear to be two women of color, African-American women, who are probably servants. It looks like that one woman on the right is holding a plate or a dish. And the reason why this photo is so significant is because I have mentioned already that the Chautauqua really was geared for the Protestant white middle class. And so most of the photos are showing people who are white. So this was the first photo I actually found, and I found it in the Franklin County Historical Society, of depicting any women who were not white at the Chautauqua. But of course, it leaves more questions than answers, because I'm not sure if these women were local women from Ottawa who were hired to help, if they are servants of one of the women at the table. And I will draw your attention, this is actually one of my last presentations, someone pointed this out to me, that the woman on the right, standing in the back, has a similar dress pattern to the women kind of in the far front of our photo. So possibly that could be an indicator that those women are servants of that woman in the front. But I think that the reason I like to show this photo is because the Chautauqua was really reflective of many of the social reform movements during this time period that really only allowed the participation of white middle-class women. This was true in the WCTU, in suffrage, and women's clubs. White women really segregated Black women from fully participating in those mainstream organizations. But of course, African-American women and other women started their own organizations and were actively campaigning for all of those same issues. But this photo, I think, also parallels really the next slide, which shows a political cartoon from the early 1900s by a Kansas artist, which shows that, and go ahead to the next slide, Samantha. This shows that this racial divide is not just something scholars are looking back today to this time, but it was actually commentary on during that time. It was apparent to people living through it. And so the similar demographics between Chautauqua attendees and participants in women's suffrage, clubs, WCTU was really one reason I wanted to bring the two movements in conversation with each other. Because I think it matters to understand when we're talking about how ideas spread and who can literally sit at the table, really as how social reforms get enacted. So the next slide, and as I conclude here, Ottawa was not the only assembly to support suffrage, but it is a great example to study. Anna Howard Shaw spoke at 20 different assemblies in 1901 alone. She eventually became president of the National Suffrage Association from 1904 until 1914. And during that time period, there was really a significant connection between Chautauqua and women's suffrage. So during the time when women were really pushing against the boundaries of separate spheres and gender roles, the Chautauqua became a place where women learned from each other. They practiced organizational skills and they were activated to campaign for political reforms. And Chautauqua was just one means of campaigning for suffragists. And in the case of Kansas, it wasn't always successful. But by the early 20th century, it was one of the most effective ways of reaching thousands, if not millions of people. So trace the narrative from Chautauqua's start in 1874, when John Vincent did not condone women speakers, to the early 20th century, when women regularly spoke about suffrage, shows how women successfully claimed a public platform and turned it into a space suitable for their needs. And for a time, the Chautauqua movement was actually at the center of a rapidly growing women's movement and supported women as they pushed to change their position in society and in the public sphere. All right. And at that, I am ready for all of your questions.
Thank you, Sarah. We had one comment in the chat from Janet who says, Kansas had a statue of Governor Glick representing the state in the U.S. Capitol until 2004 when they replaced him with Eisenhower.
Really? Fascinating. I did not know that.
Well, maybe Janet would unmute and tell us more if she'd like to. So back down in the bottom white bar, if your little microphone button is red, that means you're muted, and if you would like to talk, you need to unmute. I can mute you, but I cannot unmute you.
Sure. I'm referring to the National Statuary Hall Collection, which is a collection of statues in the U.S. Capitol. Every state was invited to send two. Started in 1864, and in the year 2000, the states have been allowed to swap out statues. They can take one home, extend a different one instead. The first state to trade out a statue was Kansas. They took out a statue of George Washington Glick, who I think is the Governor Glick you're referring to, and replaced it with a statue of President Eisenhower.
Fascinating. Well, so I think that actually makes sense, because I'm pretty sure that statue of Glick is actually now at the Kansas Historical Society, because they were talking about a statue of Glick that they were trying to debating putting on display with their suffrage exhibit.
Yeah, that's very likely. There's no law about where the statues go when they leave the Capitol.
Yeah.
Most of them were funded by the state legislatures in the first place. The legislatures typically have had the decision to decide what to do with them when they take them back.
Thanks for sharing.
Sarah, I'd like to tell you thank you specifically for sharing information about, the different diversity within the organization or lack of diversity within the organization. I think it's really important as we move forward with learning about history that we acknowledge some of the things that aren't bright and shiny about the stories that we have to tell. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, I think especially it's something that I'm learning more about the racial dynamics at the Chautauqua. So I like to share that photo because it shows that even in Kansas and Ottawa, that was showing up.
So we got a comment from, I hope it's Dee Dee. If I'm saying it wrong, please accept my apologies. At the Beecher Bible and Rifle Church in Wabunsee for a time, they separated women's seats from the men's seats in the sanctuary with a low divider. Was this common in different churches in the mid to late 1800s?
Yes, especially if that would have been in the early 19th century. I guess mid to late. I'm not sure how long that would have continued. I think that was especially something I know from the early 19th century. There was more of the distinction on physically separating men and women, and it probably just depended on the denomination. So you have something like Methodist, which I think became, you could say, more liberal or more progressive in terms of women, because that's where you get like your first women ministers actually is out of the Methodist Church. So it probably just depended on the denomination of that time, whether they were continuing to really physically separate men and women, not just kind of more societally with, like I was saying, separate spheres.
How did this fit in with the Enlightenment movement?
I think that with Enlightenment, there was something to do with like the Chautauqua and this idea. I think it was more about this focus on education and access to, so many people did not have access to college during this time. So Chautauqua kind of filled in a gap for people who would have maybe wanted to attend if they could and either couldn't afford it, or like with women, maybe we're not allowed to. And so I think that is where the connection I see is that it was this idea that there was this desire to learn and be educated on these issues. And in fact, in addition to the Chautauqua having these physical programs, assemblies you could travel to, they started a distance learning program, the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. So you could be part of a book club, essentially, where you would read a series of books for 4 years, and you could do it as a group in your town, and then you could actually graduate at a ceremony when you were finished.
Do we have any other questions before I ask another one? Oh, Dee Dee has another. What type of subjects were taught at the Chautauqua before they could talk about religion, politics, and suffrage?
Yes, so I think you're referencing when I was talking about women's clubs. So that is something, and this is a reference I found actually in a book talking about Lawrence clubs, that women's clubs really wasn't proper to talk about those three things. And my theory is they actually did talk about all of those things, but maybe in private, and they didn't quite make it into their minutes. And I kind of feel like I have support for that, just seeing what was talking about at the Chautauqua. And if you have women's club members traveling to the Chautauqua to hear a lecture by Susan B. Anthony, then you have to wonder how strict they were about not talking about religion or politics or suffrage. But the Chautauqua, I think where it could kind of get away with it is because it was so rooted in this Protestant religious type of teaching, is that it had this respectability about it. And one of the things from the beginning, the Chautauqua founder really didn't want it to be a political place. So if there were politics or current events coming up, he would try to make it so Chautauqua struck a more neutral position. And so maybe there would be a debate between two sides, like a Republican and a Democrat. But I think that was part of the reason why suffrage was such a contentious issue as well, because he would sometimes try to have like a pro-suffrage speaker and an anti-suffrage speaker to try to, again, have that balance. But it was pretty clear that most of his audience were very much more in the camp of supporting suffrage. But all sorts of topics showed up on the platform. I saw one about like how to train your dog, to how to like bake a really good cake. It was truly all sorts of topics you could learn more about if you attended.
So as our society changes, what's the future platform for Chautauqua?
That's a great question. I think I saw a question come in about the current day Chautauqua. And so I don't know if anyone has been to New York Chautauqua, say something in the chat or unmute yourself, because I love to hear people's impressions of the Chautauqua in New York, because it's really fascinating when I went there. Of course, having studied it historically, to then see it in its present day form. And one of the biggest differences is that while they have maintained their emphasis on religion, it is no longer this emphasis on a Protestant religion. They call it interfaith. And so that is where I would argue the biggest diversity has shown up at the Chautauqua, because they have really done a good job of including other denominations, other Christian denominations. So Catholics are involved now, but also non-Christian. And so thus the interfaith language. And so that is something where the Chautauqua has, I think, maintained that focus. But what they do now in New York is they do each week by a theme. And so I would encourage you to check out their website. It's really interesting. But the week I was there was all about media and ethics. And so they had different speakers. James Fallows with The Atlantic was there. The woman who started factcheck.org, Marty Barron with the Washington Post. These were all people I got to hear speak in their auditorium. And so they still try to, I think, emulate this idea of bringing in really well-known speakers to talk about important subjects of today. I think that is where the Chautauqua continues to try to be relevant.
So that's sort of folded into a question from Anna. Anna writes, what types of topics do they have on religion?
It is truly all sorts. So I think every week they try to have a different pastor or faith leader be sort of the, I would say like the person that gives the religious lectures or discussions. And so I've seen just different types of topics that way. I'm trying to think back to the calendar that I had on my screen, if there was any good examples. It's all sorts. From just like kind of talking about religious practices to the similarities between different denominations or different religions, to kind of more application of the gospel, things like that is what they'll come up with.
So Didi asked, who started the Chautauqua? Was it Pastor Vincent?
It was John Vincent. Yep, John Vincent and Lewis Miller. So okay. Vincent's name was really tied to it all along.
And then Anna says, for the original Chautauqua, could single women attend?
Yes, and that's a great question, actually. And so this was one of another reasons why this was such a great space for women. So a lot of Chautauquas would actually have a boarding house for single women. So if you didn't have a family, if you weren't going to be coming with your husband or your children, you could come as a single woman and you could get a room at like a boarding house or boarding tent type of a thing, and where there'd be a matron to oversee. But that one group, I said the hobgoblins. So assumingly, those were all, they look really young. And if they are college women, then they're likely single women. So having this, like traveling together as a group to attend something like this, that would have been something they were allowed to do.
And Didi writes, when I lived in Clay Center 20 years ago, the museum director organized a fall Chautauqua each year at the town square. Do they still do that? I'm not sure about Clay Center, but I think that there have been several kind of reenactments, pop-ups of Chautauqua. There was one in Lawrence. I think I just missed it before I moved to Lawrence. At that time, whatever the Humanities Kansas was called, the State Humanities Council put that on, and they said it was a huge hit. So I would love, if you know of other Chautauquas still going on, or start a petition to get another one going, I would love to see it in action today. So I actually have a question for Jeff. Jeff's on the line. He works at our library, and there are other people who work at the library as well that can answer this question. What do you think Ida would have thought about Chautauqua? So Ida Eisenhower is Dwight's mom, and she was fairly progressive for her own time. Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I'm not really sure I can speak for Ida, but because of her her own education and her religious beliefs, I think she would have supported the concept of the Chautauqua. I'd have to look into the archives to see if she ever specifically spoke on it or attended anything remotely like that.
That would be interesting. Do we have any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to speak. Well,
hi, Dawn. It's Jane.
Hi, Miss Jane.
Hi. I think that a number of years ago that we had one in Abilene, and one of the speakers was Joyce Thayer from, I think she was from Emporia. Would any of you remember that at all? I'm old.
I remember it, Jane. This is Mita.
Good.
You aren't imagining it. It was really, really fun. They had it for several nights, and it was just an outstanding program.
It was fun, and I'm glad I remember it. Okay. I'll turn myself off.
Thank you for sharing.
Anybody else? Well, in the interest of everyone's time, first of all, I want to say thank you, Sarah. This has been really interesting to me as we learn more about women's rights and women's suffrage throughout this anniversary year. So thank you for talking about this particular concept with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And Samantha is supposed to put up some slides for me so I remember the dates and times to tell you guys. There we go. So first of all, I'd like to make sure that I thank the Eisenhower Foundation and the Union Pacific Foundation for supporting our educational opportunities. This particular program was brought to you through the National Archives Foundation in support of the 19th Amendment anniversary. So thank you to all of those people. Next slide. And our next book talk is going to be Tuesday, September 8th at 7 p.m. Warriors Don't Cry. It's a memoir about the integration of Little Rock's Central High. And Jeff, who is here, is going to be our facilitator and our conversation master on that. You can find the link information for that on our website, which is eisenhowerlibrary.gov, or on our Facebook page. We have a very special panel discussion on Tuesday the 15th at 7 p.m. This was supposed to be held this week, but because of the colleges going back to school, we had to move it to another day. This is about Eisenhower and his role in supporting women throughout his administration and the women's movement during his administration. So I'm really looking forward to that. Again, the link information's on our website and our Facebook page. Do we have another one? And then our next Lunch and Learn is Thursday, September 24th. And James Worthen will be talking to us about George Humphrey Charles Wilson and Eisenhower's War on Spending. Again, this is another one that we had to reschedule from earlier in the year. So I'm very thankful for everybody's flexibility in moving schedules around. So I hope that I can see some of you guys at these upcoming programs. I think that they're going to be great. But in the meantime, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us today.
Thank you.